This is still the conversation. Let's talk about a recent development that happened over the weekend. ECOWAS' response to coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Niger since 2020, of which the Economic Community of West African States, popularly known as ECOWAS, saw member states, Sierra Leone and Guinea-Bissau, report attempted coups in recent weeks. Now, West African leaders met in Nigeria's capital, Abuja, on Sunday for talks on their region in deepening crisis after 4 countries fell under military coup and with risk growing from Sahel jihadist conflicts. A French military withdrawal from the Sahel, the region along the Sahara Desert across Africa, has heightened concerns over conflicts spreading southwards to Guinea and, of course, the Gulf of the Guinea states, Ghana, Togo, Benin, and also Ivory Coast. International attention has focused on the most recent coup in Niger in July after troops ousted President Mohamed Bazoum, prompting ECOWAS to impose tough sanctions and close trade. And of course, joining me right now to unpack this particular development is Dr. Bakarr, Professor of Sociology at Northern Illinois University from the U.S. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
And also we have Bolu Michael, former legal advisor to the, of course, African Union. Once again, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
All right, now let's get to it, right? I'd like to start off with you, Dr. Barr. Now, ECOWAS had its 64th Ordinary Summit recently over the weekend, and a pivotal issue that was discussed or that has been considered is the security situation, particularly within the sub-region. We've seen power grabs, and there's also the issue of insurgents. How do you react to this on the agenda?
Well, I think it's a good thing. ECOWAS actually has has a lot of experience in dealing with security issues, going back to the civil wars in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Cote d'Ivoire. But I think ECOWAS needs to really, I guess, think much more deeply about the causes of conflict and not just really to react to, I guess, breach of security situations, but also to think of the ways in which you can enhance good governance and other kinds of mechanisms that actually prevent these kinds of situations in the first place. So I guess my point is that ECOWAS has a wealth of experience, but they should really draw more on the good governance aspect of what they've been doing.
I'd like to, of course, direct the same question to you, Bolu. I mean, it was pretty much a highly attended event, the 64th Ordinary Summit. And of course, we know that the president of ECOWAS spoke extensively on the security situations across the sub-region. The Nigerian president, who also doubles as the chairman of that particular, of course, organization, also talked about the security situation. What's your immediate reaction to this issue raised?
Yeah, I do agree with Prof that it's important that we employ a systems change approach to solving the issues in the region. And that means tackling issues from the root. It's very important to look at the cause of the governance issue that push people to want to come against the government of the day. However, I think ECOWAS has been doing much of talking and less of action because I think it's coming a bit too late. However, it's better late than never. It's like when, there was a coup and then they went to sleep for a bit and then something else happened in Cote d'Ivoire or Sierra Leone, and then the calls for, are we saying that if these things didn't happen in Sierra Leone, that they won't sit together and actually chart a course forward for the region? So it's not just about meeting, but actually having a concrete plan to move forward and ensure that there's stability in the governance. Yeah.
All right, I'd like to go back to you, Professor Barr. You talked about root cause in terms of the approach of ECOWAS. What do you consider the root cause of this recent trend that we are seeing in terms of power grab and attempted power grab?
So, if you actually go to the West African region, right at the point of the democratization period during the late 1990s, we have seen a consistent kind of like insecurities, beginning with civil wars in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, and then onwards later on, we saw the Sahel and so forth. So here's what we can deduce from that. Okay? We do know that, of course, with the emergence of jihadism, with the emergence of wars tied to the global war on terror and other issues from Libya and other places, we do know that there's actually destabilization of the West African region that comes from outside. That we do know that. But we also know that there are actually domestic grievances that often lead to political violence, and these have been reoccurring. So my point really is that in my work I call these things kind of like the idea of a localized security. But essentially, what it really means, you have to understand both the domestic drivers of conflict and the external drivers of conflict, and to focus on security from the one side alone typically wouldn't do it, because in as much as you can say Niger and Mali and so forth are driven by jihadi and external factors, the point is that there's also significant governance issues. So this is what I mean by the root causes, that is the domestic aspect of it tied to governance, and also, of course, understanding the regional and international security dynamics within the region that comes into the region.
I'd like to also know Bolu's opinion on this issue too, when it comes to the root cause. What would you consider a root cause or an approach that, of course, tackles the root cause? In what aspect and context?
Okay, when we look at the political economy of nations, there are definitely different factors that contribute to the lack of stability in governance in any country. However, I think what stands out for most West African countries will be corruption, because I strongly believe that a government that works for the people themselves will defend such government. And since we're not seeing that happening, is more or less people celebrating the ousting of presidents that have been there since time immemorial, or not delivering the dividends of democracy. It shows that there's a lack of good governance, and there are weak institutions in these countries. And yes, there are certain external factors as well, but I think the internal factors weigh more than the external ones in most West African countries.
Now, something pretty unique happened during the summit. We saw where the Nigerian president actually did encourage other leaders to give the outgoing president of Liberia, a standing ovation for conceding, and call it defeat right now in the just concluded Liberian elections. I mean, this went on for almost, I think, over a minute, where all the, heads of state stood up and applauded George Weah for an easy transition of power. He also commended the president of Senegal for choosing not to run anymore. Now, some have suggested that part of the approach when it comes to tackling this issue is maybe drawing up some sort of scorecard. We are talking about governance right now. People having to, enjoy the dividends of democracy and also see the process itself, pan out free and fair. Some have suggested that an approach could be, sort of drawing up performance scorecards and maybe public recognition like this. Do you think moves like this would encourage, good governance and also easy transition of power within the sub-region? I'd like to, of course, direct that to you, Professor Barr.
Yeah, so, the African Union actually have the African peer review mechanism, which essentially it's a good governance scorecard in principle. And, there is also the Mo Ibrahim, governance index. So we have these things. And now, of course, ECOWAS can also have, similar kinds of measures. In principle, those things are there. The problem is that they are not really utilized. They are not utilized faithfully. So I think, but I think the fundamental point, the fundamental issue that I wanted to pick from your point is that somehow we have to have ways of actually limiting power in a way that is actually predictable, understandable, and a clear process. And if you have that, again, it will reduce the impetus for people trying to seek to end power through other kinds of means. So how can you do that? I think you mentioned two very good examples. George Weah, I think it goes to the character of the man. I actually don't consider him to be to have lost. I think he has actually won Macky Sall in Senegal, again, Senegal has a very unique kind of situation in West Africa. But here's something that ECOWAS can focus on. They should really ask themselves, how can they actually find a mechanism through which they can ensure that people do not go beyond the regular terms of their governance, that if it is 2 terms or 1 term. I think that's where the focus has to be, that you have to enforce that. Now, I know every country is a sovereign country, that is true. But to the extent that the African Union and ECOWAS work through this idea of collective security, through this idea of non-indifference, I think, there should be a way to actually do that.
I'd like to go to you right now, Bolu. Let's talk about some of the approach which ECOWAS has adopted in sort of, containing the situation. We know of sanctions, trade sanctions. We also know of, at some point, military offensive should the need arise. Some have questioned this approach as being maybe the least effective, while some have said, well, is that actually the way to go? I'd like to know your take on this.
Being that is a diplomatic institution, I would expect that they begin with diplomacy rather than trade sanctions and all those other military mechanisms, because a house divided against itself cannot stand. And if we are kind of interdependent in terms of trade and things like that, if we are now placing sanctions on one country, it affects another country that is not even involved in the war. So I think it's not the first line of action that should be taken. And the sad thing right now is that these countries that have experienced a transition to military are getting some level of soft power and level of recognition, because we now see the likes of President Oligui in COP and on international events, and having meetings with Russia. So they've sort of gotten a level of legitimacy. And the fact that they're staying there for so long, and we see people actually celebrating on the streets, this shows that these governments are, fairly acceptable to the people on the look of it, on the face of it. So it might even be an easier route for ECOWAS to kind of sit with them, have a negotiation, and seek that they legitimize their power and authority by calling for early elections in this. It's very important to countries that the young people of countries, they still have their political aspirations alive, which is not possible in a military dispensation. So they should actually talk to these military rulers to turn to democracy that we've seen in Egypt in the case of Al-Sisi. And that's brought stability politically to the country, and that can be replicated in ECOWAS as well.
All right. Now, I'm still going to stay on the issue of sanctions, particularly trade sanctions. We know that in Niger, for instance, businesses, as a result of that, the trade sanction placed, have been affected. And the businessmen around there, even bordering Nigeria too, are beginning to complain, saying that it's affecting their livelihood. Part of the conditions given is that the democratically deposed president be released, amongst other list of details that has been, or guidelines that has been, presented as a condition for the lifting of the sanctions. I'd like to go to you, Professor Barr. What's your take on this move, the sanctions and also the conditions given, and how it affects businesses, particularly along bordering countries?
Well, I think, so I will deviate a little bit from the economic implications and so forth, but here's a key point here, okay? So when you think of stringent sanctions, stringent efforts to change the behaviors of regimes, whether you talk of military intervention, whether you talk of hard economic sanctions, those tend to work when there's a clear moral clarity on the situation. What I mean is that when you do have a country that degenerates into a civil war, where you can easily tell that the vast majority of the people are against the regime, it is easier to apply those things. When you have a situation when you have a legitimate government or a government that is reasonable, that is still enjoys some kind of support and legitimacy, it is easier to talk to them. Now, when you move on to situations that are kind of like moral ambiguity, when you have regimes, that is military regimes, for example, that come to power in situations where there's a bad governance, or people were tired, and you do have significant numbers of people kind of like supporting them, even though they are not quote-unquote legitimate. In that sense, it becomes very difficult to actually apply stringent measures, whether you talk of economic sanctions or whether you actually talk of military interventions. It is much more difficult to do that. So the bottom line is that what ECOWAS really should be doing is that to engage regimes before they actually go into coup, to engage regimes to ensure that they abide by the rules of their elections, and they do it properly, and they do it in a way that makes sense, not just some kind of elections that actually, return people to power or reinforces marginalization.
I would, of course, like to know Bolu's reaction on another issue that was raised, and that is the growing presence of separatists, jihadists, and of course insurgents, particularly across the sub-region. We know that there has been calls for the removal of Western, I call it military interventions, the likes of the French military intervention, amongst others. Now, what is your reaction to this? And do you think the sub-region has the capacity to actually face this particular, I call it trend that is happening? We are beginning to see these insurgents sort of gain momentum in recent times.
Yeah, I see that there are external and internal factors. Like we said, like we mentioned earlier. I think the jihadist, rising, uprising. I know it's more of an external factor, and that's mostly as a result of the failure from the probably neighboring countries, and now trickling down to other nations. And the fear is that if we don't take regional security cooperation to seriously in ECOWAS, it might spread to other countries as well. So ECOWAS need to collaborate more on intelligence sharing, joint military exercises, and to have a collective response, a strategy to solving this issue. The question I ask myself is, where is ECOMOG? Where is all these military outfits that we had that worked in Liberia? Where are they?
But do you think ECOWAS actually has the resources to sustain this fight?
I think we have the capacity to do that. We actually do. We have rich countries. We are rich in resources. The issue is not that we don't have the resources. It's the management of these resources that causes problems. I mean, if we put our resources together, Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, we'll have enough for our own security. It's possible.
All right, I would like to also direct that question to Professor Barr. In terms of the growing presence of Sahel jihadists and, of course, insurgents, what is your take as regards ECOWAS' approach, and what do you suggest as a way forward in this fight?
Yeah, so first, one cannot really deny the existence of these kinds of jihadists and other kinds of very violent groups. Those are real. And, they are part of a global trend. But here's what we can learn, not just from the West Africa, but from Africa broadly, and also outside of Africa, including the Middle East. One of the things that we know is that, jihadists or violent extremists, they survive in places where there's somehow governance problems, issues to begin with. So I think, there has to be some kind of military strategy to contain those, to address and contain them. But that cannot really solve the problem. And we have seen this in many, many other places. It cannot really even, take us too far. So fundamentally, what we really need to do is to ensure that West African countries, they do not actually create the environment where violent extremists can actually thrive. And that means you have to reduce domestic grievances. You have to reduce domestic bad governance. Look, if generally people are not very, very discontent in their country, they are less likely to actually collaborate or harbor people who will bring violence. And people who bring violence from outside can only really succeed if they can actually get collaborators within the countries. So the bottom line is that you have to really address the domestic causes of political grievance. That will actually make it a less friendly environment for you to actually have external violent groups.
Now, one issue, of course, being discussed also is the economic, I call it integration or economic coexistence of these countries. We know that since the COVID-19 pandemic, many countries across the world have been trying to sort of bounce back from the effect of this particular pandemic. One of such, of course, we know in Africa, there's been a lot of initiative and all of that. And right now, ECOWAS has pushed some policies forward to allow for some sort of economic coexistence. I mean, what's your take on some of these policies, and do you think there are steps in the right direction? I'd like to, of course, direct that to you, Bolu.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the purpose of regional integration. That's the purpose of, ECOWAS, to do things together, grow together politically, economically, and all. So I think it's a good step, the right step in the right direction. However, with the way the economy is globally right now, it might be more difficult now to implement. I mean, the value of currencies in different countries is very different. The trade between countries is very different. So it's quite complex and might be more difficult to implement, especially in this time where the market generally is very unpredictable. However, it's good that we have such plan in place, and it's very important that we have a clear-cut strategy as to implementation in the country. Don't forget as well that we are quite a diverse region as well. We have the Portuguese among us, we have the French, we have the English as well. So it might be a bit complex, might be a bit difficult, but if it could work in Europe, despite how diverse they are, it's possible for us to replicate the same in ECOWAS.
All right, I'd also like to direct the same question to you, Professor Barr, but this time around, given into context issues like unified currency, and also the fact that some have suggested that in terms of trade restrictions, around visa and also customs, will I call it a pass, that being laid down vis-a-vis the local market in each country.
Yeah, so I think we began with the idea of corruption, and each time we speak, corruption comes again. So as I understand it, a lot of the AU rules, the AU and ECOWAS rules on free trade, there's a lot of actually liberal rules about movement of people, goods, and services, and so forth. Those things actually on the ground, they tend to be actually much more stifled than actually what the rules are. You will have rules that actually says free movement of people, and on the ground, you will actually have police officers and state officers who will actually give people hassle. I know these things, through the Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea access, where you have people, traders, and moving back and forth goods. So I guess to actualize the economic integration of West African countries, in addition to those rules that are passed, which are important, that is to liberalize things, the actual applications of those things have to really reflect that, because too often what you have is that really, border guards, police officers on the roads, and so forth, they apply actually more rules, more restrictions than actually what the protocols allow. So, and I think that is part of the corruption. So, if I can summarize in a very simple way, to facilitate economic integration, we have to actually remove not just the structural rules at the top, but also we have to facilitate their implementation on the ground. And that means we really have to do remove these kinds of corruptions that actually impede ordinary traders as they move their goods and services around the region.
All right. Let's go back to, of course, political matters, where this debate has come up quite a number of times, talking about if democracy in itself is the best form of government as a blanket form of government for Africa. I would like to know your thoughts on this, Bolu Michael, and before, of course, I get that of Professor Barr.
Okay, I think democracy is the best, is one of the best alternatives it still remains the best alternative for West African countries, because it gives power to the people. However, under democracy, there are different styles of governance as well. I kind of favor the parliamentary system because of how robust it is, how representative it is, and how it can foster easy and quick change. For instance, like we saw in the UK a couple of months ago or year now, that they had Liz Truss for a couple of days in office. When it turned out that she was not performing up to expectation. We need such a kind of leadership or structure whereby incompetence can be fired as soon as possible. Not that we have to bear in the name of democracy a bad government for 4, 8 years, sometimes 20 years. So yes, democracy works, but the style of democracy does matter as well.
So what style would you rather, recommend that maybe a lot of African countries adopt? Because, I mean, if you look at what I call it cultural mindset, the religious mindset, the ethical mindset, it seems a bit different from, the style of practice in the West. So, and some have argued that that's why we are beginning to see a resurgence of coups in Africa. What style would you rather recommend we adapt to suit, us as Africans?
Yeah, I know that traditionally and historically, the top to bottom approach is what most African countries are used to, whereby there's a king or somebody, in a place of authority giving orders and then we follow. But times have changed, and countries must change along with. I do believe that democracy works because power deserves to be in the hands of the people. There's no nation without the people in the nation that makes the nation. I favor the parliamentary style because of the dynamic, the way it works, the dynamic way it works. Like I said earlier, and for example, Liz Truss in the UK, where she spent just a couple of days in office. Well, the reason why people are frustrated and kicking against their government because they're tired of incompetence, they're tired of bad governance. They've gotten to a place, they're choking, they've gotten to a place of what sociologists call a state of anomie, a state of discontent, and they get frustrated and then they resort to self-help. That's because they've tolerated for so long. But in a parliamentary system, when you see that the government is not working, it has lost the confidence of the parliamentarians and the people, they get removed in a matter of days and somebody else takes over. I think that's what we need. That might help in bringing a level of long-term stability in the region.
All right, Professor Barr, do you think that a parliamentary style of democracy would work for us?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't really frame it so much in the question of parliamentary or non-parliamentary, but I think the general point is that democracy is good for us. I think I've said this in some other occasions, but I think we really have to ask what is democracy, and we have to be smart about it. When you say democracy, what you really mean is representation of people and the limitations on power. Now, to talk of democracy in vacuum makes no sense. You only talk of democracy in relation to a state. The development of a state and the development of democracy are not one and the same thing, but they do go together. So you can only have a democracy when you understand the nature of the state. And I think this is where we have failed in many African countries. We do not consider what is the nature of the state. Now, oversimplification, but the bottom line is that African states are what you can call divided countries along some kind of identities that are very rigid. So to make democracy work in Africa, you have, in West Africa in particular, you have to go to a kind of political system that avoid a winner-take-all situation. What I mean is that when you have electoral systems in which you go to elections, one group wins by a simple majority, and then they claim all the power and they marginalize everybody else, that will not produce democracy. So whether you talk of federal systems, whether you talk of rotational systems, whether you talk of actually ways of actually having different organs of the state controlled or occupied by different people, distribution, however you do it, the bottom line is that democracy has to reflect the identities of the people that you have. From here, then you can move on to other kinds of competencies, governance matters, and so forth. But fundamentally, you have to address the idea of representation. That is, how do you create a political system that is representative of the way the people see themselves? That is where the question of democracy is.
Of course, gentlemen, before we wrap up the show, I'd like to ask, I'll start off with you, Bolu. Recently, I had a conversation with the information minister in Sierra Leone, and he talked about the attempted coup that happened recently. Part of those being fingered included a former president. And in his words, he said that they are going anywhere the investigation leads. Now, my question is, what can ECOWAS do to actually stem the trend of power grab happening across, particularly the sub-region?
Okay, well, it's important. Everything should always start with a conversation, not just taking arbitrary actions. So it's very important that ECOWAS sit and have this conversation and try to make parties involved to recognize that this thing is not beneficial for the people, and if indeed they have the interest of the people at heart, they should be able to, switch gears and turn around from their intentions. It's unfortunate if it's true that the former president is the one behind all the challenges. It's a very bad sign. It's a red flag. It's very important that leaders understand that being in office is not a birthright, but actually a honor that is bestowed on them. They are holding that power in trust the people. So there should be conversations. That should be the first step. To sit down with the persons involved and try to work a way out and just let them see that whatever the action may be, it's not for the benefit of the country, but for the benefit of the people and the sub-region as a whole.
All right, just quickly in 30 seconds, Professor Bao, I would like to know your take.
I'll go to three things. One is that ECOWAS should see all these kinds of situations as political problems, and they should focus on political dialogue. That's number one. Number two, ECOWAS should actually go back and think of how to hold legitimate and democratic governments accountable. And number three, ECOWAS should actually be thinking of how each and every West African country can design a better political system that is provide a better democracy that is much more representative of people, as opposed to the kinds of democracies that we have seen that are just winner-take-all situations. That's where they have to go.
Gentlemen, Dr. Abubakar Ba, Professor of Sociology, Northern Illinois University from the U.S., and also Bolu Michael-Biyi, former legal advisor to the African Union. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us. Thank you.
It's on that note we drop the curtains on today's episode of The Conversation. Join me again next time. My name is Dapo Adegboye. Bye for now.